This is Canada Reads American Style, featuring two friends who love Canada Reads and Canadian literature. Welcome our host Rebecca from Michigan and Tara from Ontario. Hi everyone, it is Rebecca, and today I am speaking with Canadian author Leslie Shimotakahara, who is an award-winning author of 3 novels and a memoir, as well as numerous short fiction and essays. She won the Canada-Japan Literary Prize in 2012 and has been shortlisted for the K.M. Hunter Artist Award. Her writing has appeared in the National Post, World Literature Today, Changing the Face of Canadian Literature, and other anthologies and periodicals. She holds a PhD in English from Brown University and lives in Toronto with her husband. Her 4th novel, The Breakwater, which we will be discussing today, will be published in April 2026 by Cormorant Books. And Leslie, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm so delighted to be here.
Fantastic. And for those of you who may remember, but I will put it in the show notes, I did talk to Leslie back on June 10th, 2024, and talked about her book, Sisters of the Spruce, which Tara and I both absolutely loved. And I also want to say that your new book, The Breakwater, I've read it twice. I really, really enjoyed it, and I can't wait for us to discuss this book. So why don't we just start out with tell us a bit about the book and how it came about?
The novel is inspired by a family trip that I took with my parents and my grandparents around 1990 when I was 12. And my grandparents, like many Japanese Canadians, well, like pretty much all Japanese Canadians of their generation, had been interned in British Columbia. They had lived in Vancouver and Victoria. And then during the Second World War, they had been interned in camps that had been hastily set up in ghost towns in the interior of the province. And then after the war, they had been released and forced to leave British Columbia. So they migrated to Ontario. So this was going to be their first time returning to BC. And I thought that the purpose of this trip was going to be a sort of last glance backward, kind of a nostalgia trip where we would be visiting some of their old haunts, perhaps their old houses, their old schools, and that sort of thing. And we did do quite a bit of that. But the shocker was that partway through the trip, my grandfather announced, I think over breakfast, that there was a relative that he wanted us to visit that very day who had been in a care home for many decades since he'd been a young man. He'd been committed to Essondale Asylum, which was the asylum about 30 minutes outside of Vancouver. And my grandfather, as a young man, had been the one that had committed his brother, Akira. And during the internment years, Akira had remained in the asylum. And then, when the asylum downsized, and I think it was the 1960s or 70s, he'd been moved around to different sort of smaller institutions within BC's mental health care system. And my grandfather, at some point, had tracked down his whereabouts by way of, I think, writing letters to various hospital administrators. I really don't know how he managed to track down Akira's location because this was, of course, before the internet days.
Yeah.
But he had managed to find out where his brother had been living and had been exchanging letters with the head nurse at this facility for many years and sending care packages of magazines and chocolates and slippers and items of clothing. And now was finally ready to go and visit him. And so that afternoon, we drove to the facility, which was called Acacia House. It was, for those who are familiar with Vancouver Island, it was quite close to Shawnigan Lake. And yeah, it's definitely one of my most vivid childhood memories of going into this home, which was quite a architecturally was quite an interesting sort of old house that had been large old mansion out in the woods that had been kind of retrofitted as a care home.
Hmm.
And I remember we were all waiting in the sort of sitting room, and then Akira, my great uncle, was guided into the room, and he had a lot of resemblance to my grandfather, except he was kind of a better looking version of my grandfather, which my grandmother talked about after this encounter. That had been her impressions of him when she had known him before he'd been committed. And the encounter between my grandfather and his brother was really startling. The two men just sort of looked at each other, became speechless, kind of catatonic, I think, in the case of Akira, just completely overwhelmed by emotion. And so it was that sort of scene of this encounter that stayed with me over the years and the decades as a writer, kind of teased at my imagination and provided the central inspiration for The Breakwater, which is a novel. So many elements are changed and are fictionalized, but the backbone of the story derives from that family trip.
So I'm going to jump in and just ask too, is your grandfather still alive, and is your mother, like, I'm just wondering how the family dynamics play out now that this novel is coming out, but if
Mhm.
unless they're not with us anymore.
My grandfather died many years ago.
Okay.
I think it was around the year 2000 or maybe the early 2000s. So I think he died about 5 or 6 years after we made this trip.
Oh, okay.
Or so, no, yeah, so it would have actually been in the mid to late 90s.
Okay.
I certainly wouldn't have been able to write it, I don't think, while he was still alive. But yeah, my mother's generation, well, I don't want to speak for them, but certainly no one's told me not to write about it. And I think they've all sort of taken interest and shown, curiosity. Yeah. So,
Okay. I just want to mention that the novel begins with the two brothers who are named Stum and Yaz, and they are fishing by the breakwater. And I wanted to know, can you talk about the breakwater's significance and how that became the title?
yes. Well, the breakwater is referring to Ogden Point Breakwater, which is an actual breakwater in Victoria, which we visited on that original trip. And it's a very dramatic breakwater. As we were walking along it with my grandfather out into the sea, the water's turbulent on both sides. He talked about how he used to fish there with his siblings when he was a youngster. And back then you could actually catch salmon, supposedly. And he had spotted this famous sea monster one day that was rumored to sort of lurk in these waters, and it had a horse-shaped head. And yeah, he talked about how that memory really stayed with him of seeing this strange sort of creature in the distance. He never talked about fishing there with his brother, but once I learned about this brother's existence, it seemed quite likely to me that they had fished there together, because his brother Akira would have been the only male sibling that was close in age to my grandfather. And so then, as I began in the early years of beginning to write about this, it occurred to me, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if Yaz and Stum, the two characters who are sort of based on my grandfather and Akira, were out there as young boys fishing and one day spotted this sea monster in the distance and had very different reactions to the sighting. Yaz being very cautious and hesitant to believe that the monster was real, and Stum being just sort of overjoyed and taking it as a sign of his amazing luck, which is sort of emblematic of how he's much more impetuous and risk taking. And so then this basic contrasting dynamic between the two brothers is something that the novel explores over the course of 300 pages.
And I love too that the book opens with the breakwater and it concludes with the breakwater. So I thought that was just a beautiful. So was it easy then just to know that was what the title was going to be?
Yeah, the title came to me quite quickly. Yeah. The writing actually began with a short story called The Breakwater, a
Oh,
short
okay.
story that was published in 2020 in the anthology called Changing the Face of Canadian Literature, edited by Dane Swan. And the story also centers on that scene at the breakwater.
I'm going to get a copy of that because I want to read that as well. So, oh, I love that. Again, I loved this story. There are so many layers to it. So I want just everyone to know it isn't just a family story in that sense or this difference or this tragic idea of the brothers being separated and why, etc. Also, the Japanese internment, which is really a central part of the story as well. But lies and lies of omission also play an important part of the story. And can you talk about the motivation and repercussions of telling lies within this family? Because it is alive and well throughout this story.
Yeah, yeah, there are many lies and lies of omission. The most glaring one being that this brother exists at all. No one of my mother's generation, as far as I'm aware, knew of his existence, and
Wow.
certainly no one of my generation. And when we returned from that trip in 1990, my mother told her two siblings about what had transpired on this trip, that, they have this uncle that has been secreted away in the mental health care system. And they were pretty shocked. So, yeah, I think the reason that my grandfather kept Akira's existence a secret was probably that he was quite ashamed to begin with of having a brother, a black sheep brother, who as a young man had been committed to Essondale Asylum. And then I think there was a sort of secondary shame around having not, in the ensuing decades, visited him in BC or done anything to secure his release. Of course, during the internment years and during its aftermath, when my grandfather was reestablishing himself in Ontario, in Hamilton, Ontario, resettling, started his own family, he wouldn't have been able to take that on. But I think by the 1960s and 1970s, when he was comfortably reestablished in his life and actually, heading towards his retirement years, this was very much weighing on his conscience, as indicated by the fact that he went to some trouble to track down his brother's whereabouts and then wrote letters for many years with the head nurse there, but just couldn't quite bring himself to make the trip until he was around 80.
Yeah.
I think there was tremendous shame and guilt. And then the repercussions are that on this trip, he has to face the shock of his daughter and his granddaughter. In the novel, it's just the granddaughter and her mother who accompany him on the trip. And he has to provide some sort of accounting or some sort of explanation, both to his family and to himself, about how this situation came to be. And in so doing, he has to have a kind of reckoning with himself and also a reckoning with his own role in the tragedy, because some of the reasons why he committed, Yaz committed Stum to the asylum are self serving ones.
Yeah. Now, another little thread that kind of I feel like it's like a little gem that kind of runs through the novel is that Tessa, the granddaughter, is reading And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. And so I really actually wondered, was that something you literally did at that time? Or was there a reason why that kind of is threaded through the story?
Yes, yeah. As a preteen, I was very much a fan of classical detective stories. And I probably was reading And Then There Were None around that time in my life. And so I think the reason that I chose that particular novel, And Then There Were None, is, well, for one thing, it's one of the more interesting Agatha Christie novels, I would say. And for those few readers out there who may not be familiar with the story, although I think most people probably are, it's about 10 strangers who are lured to an island, a deserted island off the coast of Devon under various pretexts. And then one by one, they're murdered in punishment for various crimes they've committed, but crimes that the law can't punish. And then at the end, the mastermind behind this whole grandiose scheme is revealed, and the reasons for each person's execution are revealed, and all loose ends are wrapped up. So, part of my thinking in incorporating references to this novel within my own novel by way of Tessa sort of enthusiastically talking about this novel as she's reading it and carrying it around in her purse during this trip is that I wanted to contrast those sorts of mysteries and mystery novels with the sort of messier and much more ambiguous mysteries that characters in my novel are confronting, mysteries that don't have these sort of tidy resolutions. Because one thing that Tessa comments on as the novel unfolds is that her grandfather, in some ways, can be seen as having committed a crime that the law can't punish in committing his brother to the asylum, partly for self-serving reasons. I don't want to give away any spoilers here, but personal guilt is part of the equation, as well as the sort of larger political context of the Japanese Canadian internment. And yeah, so my novel doesn't offer the sort of comforting statements around motivation and verdicts of guilt that a classical detective novel does.
And that I was telling you that right before we started recording, that that's one of the things I loved about this novel is that the people are the characters are real. The characters feel very real, and everything, it plays out in a way that feels this is how it would have been. Because I think if we'd had a really tightly tied up, everybody hugs it out at the end and everybody's happy and everybody feels better and life goes on and it's wonderful, would have felt completely false. But that you tell this story in a way that feels like how it would be in a real family setting. And that was one of the things that I really, really appreciated about the novel. Now, here's the big question, though, that was really weighing on my mind the whole time. I read it both times, which is how easy or difficult was it writing a novel based on your family history? Because you're revealing a part of your family history, but you're also obviously taking poetic license and crafting a story. So I just wondered where was the line for you? How did you know like how much to put in that was real versus the creative part?
Yeah, I think it's mostly a matter of gut instinct. I began writing this novel in 2017, so it obviously took some time to write. And I think part of the reason for that was because there were some mental obstacles I had to overcome, ones that you've alluded to around, well, around the fact, for one thing, that not very many people within my family knew about this man's existence. I think over time, my mother may have mentioned it to a couple of her cousins, and I mentioned it to one of my cousins when I told her I was working on this project. And everyone has been kind of uniformly startled, I would say, to find out that a parent had this sibling that just sort of vanished from the family many decades ago.
Yeah.
So I did have like a certain amount of trepidation around how would people respond if I were to sort of really put this period of our family history under the microscope? But at the same time, I felt this is very much a story that needs to be told. And my father was actually very supportive of me writing this novel, so much so that a number of years ago, he and I actually took a road trip to Vancouver Island, just the two of us, to reconstruct the trip that we had taken with our family in 1990. And we revisited many of the same places, such as Ogden Point Breakwater, which by the time we made our second trip was no longer quite as dramatic because the city had put up these very sort of high guardrails
Ah,
on both sides of the breakwater to protect people from, getting knocked over and washed out to sea because it can be very windy out there.
yeah.
But the experience of walking along the breakwater was no longer nearly as dramatic because your proximity to the elements is lessened. We also visited a building called the Janyon, which I remember my grandfather had pointed out to us in 1990 as it had been a famous brothel back in his day. Looked like sort of a decrepit hotel, all boarded up. But by the time my father and I made our second trip, it had actually been turned into a high end condo
Oh,
with like a sort of glass tower on top of the historical podium. And my dad and I, we drove around Shawnigan Lake looking for the care home where Akira had been living in 1990. And we couldn't find it. And I could find nothing online about this facility. So I assume it was probably torn down, decommissioned. But that road trip, the second road trip, was very useful in terms of research and just sort of stimulating my writerly imagination. And that really made it a lot easier for me to get started.
so do you anticipate that there will be any pushback by anybody in the family at this stage, or is it long enough history where people are just going to appreciate the story for what the story is as a fictional tale?
Hmm. Well, I certainly hope the latter. One can never anticipate how everyone in the family will respond, but I tried to sort of tell the story in my novel with empathy and, understanding for the really sort of difficult situations that all the characters are in.
And I just want to also tell everyone when you read this novel, I want to encourage you to read it because we are being very careful with not divulging too many of the specifics because there are so many layers, there are so many fascinating things that take place, and you start to understand the dynamics within the family and how it all came to be. So I told Leslie, I don't want to do any spoilers. I don't want to hint at any spoilers because this book will keep you moving forward, wanting to know how it all plays out. So I just want to say that if this sounds a little like nebulous, I just want everyone to know it's a compelling story that moves you forward. Okay.
Oh, thank you,
Yeah,
Rebecca. I'm so
absolutely.
happy
Yeah,
to hear that.
absolutely. Now, I want to ask and I'll ask you at the end about anything else that's coming up later because I don't want to forget to ask that. But are there any reading recommendations, past or current titles you'd like to share with our listeners? Because as Tara always says, we like to grow our TBRs.
Yeah, well, one of the memorable historical novels that I've read recently is Flashlight by Susan Choi, which was shortlisted for the Booker. And yeah, that novel definitely stayed with me. It's about the disappearance of a Korean professor from a beach in Japan. So, first, I sort of thought we were in literary thriller territory, but then the novel keeps transforming and kind of defying readerly expectations as it explores these really complex facets of history, family, and memory.
Oh, that sounds good.
A couple of Canadian books that I'll mention. I recently read Worldly Girls by Tamara Jong,
Oh, I want to read that. Yeah.
whom I also was on a panel with at the Brockton Writers Series back in January. And I really enjoyed her memoir, which chronicles growing up as a biracial, half Chinese kid within the culture of Jehovah's Witness. And yeah, it's very skillfully told, going back between present and past through these sort of linked essays that kind of center around her mother's tragic death and how that's had far reaching consequences for her own life. And then I'll also mention another memoir that I read not too long ago by an author named Kate Gies. It's a medical memoir, and it's called It Must Be Beautiful to Be Finished. And this is a novel, or this is a memoir about the author who's born missing an ear and then from a young age undergoes a series of very invasive medical procedures and surgeries aimed at fixing what our culture tells us isn't normal. And then, far from correcting the problem, it just causes her a lot of pain, both physical and emotional, until she finally just sort of decides she's going to stop having these procedures. And yeah, this memoir, it resonated with me greatly because I spent much of my youth being treated for scoliosis by wearing a back brace and then a torso cast for several months. And then ultimately, I had a spinal surgery, which yielded quite mixed results. And so, yeah, that medical memoir really resonated with me in terms of its critique of the medical profession and how it relates to issues of gender.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Those all three sound really fabulous. So thank you for sharing those. And now I do want to ask if you have anything else you're working on. Is there anything that we can anticipate for the future? Because even though this one's just coming out, I love your writing and I'm looking forward to whatever comes next.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm working on another historical novel that's actually inspired by a diary that was kept by my great grandfather
Ooh.
on my mother's side when he first immigrated to Canada in the 1890s. He immigrated to northern British Columbia and was working in the fishing and logging trades while writing various reports about his findings for the Japanese government, for the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce, as it was known at the time. And so this diary, which has been within the family for many years, was recently translated through the efforts of two of my mother's cousins who brought on a professional translator. And it's been really interesting over the past few years to be able to just read that diary and get a kind of window into my great grandfather's early experiences. And so that's provided a kind of creative springboard for yet another historical novel. And because I do like to sort of have two projects on the go simultaneously, I'm also in the very early stages of writing my own medical memoir about my whole experience of growing up with scoliosis.
Okay, I just have to say that I think your family has been this creative touchstone for you because so much you've written so many amazing books with that thread of a connection to your family. And I honestly, I think they've been just a wellspring for you for creatively, right?
Yeah, yeah, I'm very fortunate in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's kind of, I don't know of another author that has been able to do that in the same way. And I think it's kind of a gift from your family. So I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm grateful that there have been so many storytellers within my family, like at
Yeah.
family dinners. My grandmother was a great storyteller and just, passing on passing on these accounts of the past, some quite dark and harrowing, and being open about family secrets when they come to light. And I'm really appreciative that my mother took me on the trip to the care home to see Akira, and wasn't just sort of like, this isn't appropriate for a child,
Right.
like, let's just like get my father to take me to a movie that afternoon or something like that. I mean, I'm grateful to my mother's cousins for having translated the diary.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Leslie, I hope when the next book comes out, whichever one comes out first, I hope that you'll come back and chat with us again. I just really love your work, and I want to encourage everyone to read The Breakwater, which comes out in early April.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. It's been such a pleasure chatting as always.
All right, everyone, happy reading.
Thank you for joining us on our bookish journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing Canada Reads American Style wherever you listen. You can connect with the podcast and Rebecca on Instagram at Canada Reads American Style, and with Tara at On a Branch Reads. Until next time, keep reading.